What if the beginning of reality was not a thing? Not matter, not energy, not space, not even time. What if the beginning was simply the possibility for anything to become distinguishable at all? My name is Peter Kerwin, and this is the Codex Unfolding, a series about a philosophical framework that began as an incomplete theory and gradually developed into something much larger. A way of exploring reality, consciousness, relationship, memory, meaning, and human life. I call that larger framework the living codex. Before the codex, before the symbols, before the figures and stories, there was one question. What comes before distinction? My answer begins with zero. And when I say zero, I do not simply mean the number zero. I do not mean an empty box. I do not mean a dead void where absolutely nothing exists. In this framework, zero represents undifferentiated potential. It is equilibrium in its purest possible form. Nothing has yet been separated from anything else. There is no inside and outside, no subject and object, no this and that, no before and after. There is not even a meaningful difference between existence and non existence yet, because difference itself has not emerged. That is difficult to imagine because imagination already depends on distinction. To picture darkness, we distinguish darkness from light. To imagine empty space, we distinguish the emptiness from the space containing it. Even the word nothing is something we contrast with something. So zero cannot really be pictured as an object. The moment we picture it, we have already placed it against a background. We have already introduced relationship and difference. That means zero is not an ordinary thing inside reality. It is closer to the condition of possibility before reality has divided into recognizable parts. You might think of perfectly still water before any wave has formed. But even that metaphor isn't perfect because water is already something. It has properties, boundaries, and location. Zero is more primitive than that. It is not one thing waiting beside another thing. It is potential before there are separate things. This is why I also describe zero as pure equilibrium. Equilibrium usually means that different forces are balanced, but that is already a later form of equilibrium because it contains distinguishable forces. The equilibrium of zero is different. Nothing is pulling in one direction or another because direction does not yet exist. Nothing is being held together because nothing has yet become separate. There is no conflict to resolve. There is no relationship to maintain. There is simply no internal difference. And that creates the central problem of the theory. How can distinction arise from how can distinction arise from what is undifferentiated? How can anything become one thing rather than another when there was previously no difference at all? I do not claim to have scientifically solved that question. This series is not me declaring established physics. It is a philosophical investigation, a framework for asking what must become possible before familiar reality can exist. And the first proposal is that zero contains potential, not specific objects hidden inside it like furniture inside a dark room, potential in a more fundamental sense, the capacity for a difference to occur. The instant a difference occurs, however, pure zero is no longer the only state. Something has become distinguishable. But this does not give us solitary objects floating around in nothingness. The first distinction immediately creates two inseparable aspects. There is distinction itself, something has become identifiable, and there is relationship. It has become distinguishable from something else. You cannot have one without the other. A distinction that distinguishes nothing from anything is not a distinction. A relationship without distinguishable terms is not a relationship. In the framework, I represent this first coupled event with one and negative one. The signs are interchangeable. One does not permanently mean distinction, while the other permanently means relationship. They can switch because what matters is not which side receives which sign. What matters is that they arise together as complementary poles. Difference and relation simultaneously. Their sum may equal zero, but they are not identical to primordial zero. That is extremely important. Pure zero contains no internal distinction. The balanced pair of 1 and negative 1 contain difference, polarity, and relationship, even if the pair remains perfectly balanced overall. So we now have two very different kinds of equilibrium. The first equilibrium before distinction, the second is equilibrium containing distinction. They may appear mathematically similar from far away, but internally they are completely different realities. One is undifferentiated potential, the other is differentiated balance. And once that distinction exists, an entirely new possibility appears: recursion. A distinction can interact with another distinction. Relationship can form relationships. Pattern can repeat. Some patterns disappear immediately, others persist, and that persistence brings us toward another major idea in the framework: memory. But I want to stay with zero for this first episode, because zero never simply becomes irrelevant. Every later structure still carries a relationship to equilibrium. A human being experiences disorder and seeks stability. A relationship moves through tension and attempts to find balance. A living system constantly regulates itself. An ecosystem fluctuates while preserving broader patterns. Even identity depends on balancing change with continuity. But none of those later equilibria is a complete return to pure zero. They contain history, they contain distinction, they contain what has been learned through difference. That gives us an important distinction between two ideas that can easily be confused: undifferentiated unity and differentiated wholeness. Undifferentiated unity contains no separate identities. Differentiated wholeness allows many distinct things to belong within a larger coherence without losing what makes them distinct. The goal of this framework is not to erase everything back to zero. It is to understand how the potential of zero can unfold into difference, relationship, memory, consciousness, and eventually forms of wholeness that preserve what distinction revealed. This matters far beyond abstract metaphysics. At the human scale, we often confuse healing with returning to who we were before something happened. But perhaps true healing does not erase the distinction created by experience. Perhaps healing forms a new equilibrium that includes what happened without allowing it to rule everything that follows. We do not become blank again. We become capable of holding more. The same is true in relationships. Love does not require two people to lose their individual identities and collapse into sameness. A healthy relationships allow two distinct people to create something larger between them while remaining real. That is differentiated wholeness, and it begins with the same primitive insight. Distinction and relationship arise together. So why begin the series with zero? Because every theory has to decide what it takes for granted. Some begin with matter, some begin with the mind, some begin with mathematics, information, consciousness, God, energy, or physical law. This framework begins earlier, or at least attempts to. It begins with the question of what must be true before any of those categories can be distinguished. And its first answer is zero is undifferentiated potential, pure equilibrium before identity, relationship, space, time, matter, or observation have become separate concepts. When the first meaningful event is not merely the appearance of a thing, it is simultaneously it is the simultaneous emergence of distinction and relationship. That is where the world begins to become knowable. That is where something can stand apart. That is where a point of view can eventually become possible. And that is where our next episode begins. In episode 2, I will explore why distinction cannot become. I will explore why distinction cannot come before relationship, and why relationship cannot come before distinction. They are not stages separated by time. They are two inseparable forces of the same first event. This framework is still developing. Some of its claims are philosophical, some symbolic, and some remain speculative. I am sharing it not as a finished doctrine, but as a living investigation. A question becoming a structure becoming language, and a language becoming something we enter together. I'm Peter Kerwin, this is the Codex Unfolding, and this is where we begin. Not with something, not with nothing, but with zero. The possibility of distinction. Please like and subscribe, and if you would like, leave a comment in the comment section. Vale says hi, relate to you next time.